When you see young children going to school on the first day, you're so happy for them that they are there, that they're in a place where you can remember being. And the excitement of that first day of school is an amazing excitement. I can still remember the smell of the school on the first day that I went to grade 1. It's something you never forget. The memories of the things that occurred at that time in your life were so very important to you as you get older. And so as a result, when my children were getting ready to start school, I would talk about those moments in my life. I'd talk about how exciting that was and how fun it was, and I'd try to make it fun for them. And when my granddaughter starts school, I'm going to tell her those same stories.
The thing that gets me really excited about public education is something that I connect back to something that Stephen Lewis has said. And he has said that public education and public teachers have the most noble job, the most noble profession. And if I think about that statement, I really believe that that's true. Because if we think about the honor and the privilege, and those aren't empty words, that we have to work with people's children every day, to embrace them into the system of school, to say you matter, to say you belong, to say we are going to learn alongside you and we're going to bring your family in too, that is exciting work to do. That's a foundation of a democratic society. Parents send us their kids every day. They send us their very best. They send us the people who they love most in the world. That's exciting to me.
Well, public education is very important, especially to people like me. I grew up in apartheid South Africa. And in apartheid South Africa, if you were not a white person, it didn't really matter whether you went to school or not. Education wasn't given a high priority for people other than the dominant white population. And the rest of the population either couldn't afford education, or there were no schools available for them to go to get themselves educated. And so we began to see how important education was, because in order to survive in a racist society, you really had to have education. And the irony was that the people who needed it most didn't get it. So as we moved to different countries, we began to see education becoming more and more accessible to larger numbers of people, until we arrived in Canada almost 40 years ago and recognized just how critically important public education was for many different reasons. And one of the reasons is very simple, and that is that if you had the kind of inequities that you had in South Africa, they were not going to be redressed until such time everybody had similar opportunities. And so it struck us as very important when we came to this country that public education was one of the great equalizers.
My public education introduced me into a world that I wouldn't have possibly known if I would have been homeschooled, or if I'd have gone to a private school or an independent school or a charter school or something like this. I was introduced into a world where people spoke a different language. I spoke a different language than they did, right? Where they held different values, where they went to different churches, where they participated in different activities, and I played with them. I learned how to get along with them. I learned what I could do to make their lives better, and I learned that all in public school. Between my home and my public school, I learned that.
I was raised as a young Aboriginal guy on an old Indian reserve. First of all, in my family, education was very important. My grandmother had gone to a residential school, and she was raising us because my mother had passed away when I was a baby. And so my brothers and my sister and I were being raised by our grandparents. To my grandmother, education was the most important thing that we did as children. It was not about playing. It was not about, other than going to church, of course, it was not about anything else except going to school. And so she made us understand that, and she made us appreciate that we had a responsibility. My grandfather, who was almost 90 years old when he passed away, used to talk about how there was an education clause in our treaties. And he said, he used to tell us that the reason that it's there is because the people who signed the treaties for us wanted us to get an education. And so he said, you have a responsibility to them to make sure that you get an education. So I always believed in the importance of education. Even at those times in my life when I found, because of other reasons, that it couldn't be as large a player as I wanted it to be when I wasn't in school and I was trying to do other things, I always felt the need or the desire to go back to school. And I'll tell you this, even today, at my age, with my experience and my background and the education that I've received, I really want to go back to school and learn some more, because I love the learning environment. I just love the intellectual challenge of study, and I love the ability to gain new knowledge and to share that experience of learning with other people, whether or not they're my age. I think education probably has 4 important purposes. For young people, first of all, to go through an education system and to succeed at it is an accomplishment, and I think we need to understand that. It's a sign of accomplishment as well. Many employers will not look at individuals who've not graduated from a high school level, at least, and there's a number of reasons for that. It's not because high school necessarily teaches you the skills you need in order to be able to function in an employment situation, but what it does tell an employer is that you can accomplish something. And so it's an accomplishment to do that, and people recognize it for that reason. But at the same time, it does teach you things. It gives you basic knowledge about history, basic knowledge about sciences, basic knowledge about things that you need in order to go on to become a specialist in society, to develop a career based upon that knowledge. People who do carpentry and auto mechanics need to understand fundamental things about mathematics and arithmetic and reading and writing. And school is designed to give us those skills. And so it's hard to appreciate that as a young person, but at the same time, as you get older, and you, particularly when you have your own children, you realize just how important that is. The third most important aspect of the education system is that it provides an environment in which young people can be brought together and learn how to socialize and learn how to get along, learn how to develop an ability to function within a system, an ability to function within society, because schools are micro-societies. And so it gives them those skills, those social skills that they need. And as well, it's an environment in which you develop lifelong friendships and lifelong relationships with people. And then finally, I think it has that ability to help you to understand life, understand the big questions of life, such as where we come from and where we're going and why we're here, because it opens your mind up to knowledge of some very bright people who are prepared to share their thoughts with you. And I'm not just talking about the writers of the stories that we read, but I'm also talking about the teachers. The public education system can be a great vehicle by which we ensure that all members of society have the opportunity to function equally. It is unfortunate, though, that there are some components within the public education system that are not funded or not resourced in a way that allows children to be educated in the way that they need to be. Not all children come to a school environment with the same background, with the same ability, with the same circumstances, with the same distractions or lack of distractions. Some children come to the public education system not only hungry, but scared, frightened, and damaged. And the education system now has a responsibility to ensure that they're taken care of as well, and so that they're put in a position so that by the time they finish the education that they need in order to move on, that they are in the same position as much as possible as those other children who do not come to the schools like they do.
Oftentimes when people talk about the notion of public education, there's an immediate connection to academics. There's an immediate connection to intellectual development. Public education believes that too, but says that's not all that it is. It's about educating the entire child or educating the whole child. The notion of working to support the social education of children, the personal development, their interpersonal development, their physical development, along with the intellectual development. And that notion of this is the child who's in front of us. These are the skills that they bring. These are the experiences that they bring. And then how is it that we take what they know? How is it that we take those experiences and move that forward in their educational career? It's not the notion of here's school and here's the child, and the child needs to be ready for school at whatever grade level from K-12. But here's school and here's the child, and how can school be ready to meet that child's needs at any level from kindergarten through to grade 12. And of course, public education opens it much broader than that too, right? As we work with children and families before school, and as we work to transition children and their families back into the community or into other areas of their community once they've graduated from our school buildings. So that notion again of being very inclusive and taking a look at things from a very broad perspective. We create safe, welcoming, and caring schools. And when I say the word safe, I don't only mean that notion of physical safety, but emotional safety and intellectual safety, so that kids can come and it's their place to practice. It's their place to practice at being citizens. It's their place to practice those things that we've identified in the broadest sense of curriculum as being important. The other thing I think about in terms of a big idea of public education is the notion of being inclusive. Public education does not say, you fit, you belong, we care about you, come and join us, but not you and not you and not you. Public education is inclusive in the sense that it opens its door to all of the public. It opens its door to children whose families have been here for generations. It opens its door to families who are the founding members of Canada. It opens its door to children whose families have been in the country for a day or two or three. And so it's a place then where all kids can come and they can all learn from each other, alongside each other, and with each other. And the other thing I think about is that it's a place that doesn't tolerate but celebrates diversity. And again, when I think about that notion of diversity, I think about diversity not only in terms of cultural experiences, in terms of ethnic experiences, perhaps your religious background, but I think about diversity in terms of diversity of experience, diversity of ideas, diversity of economics, and it doesn't matter because you all belong. And so then those big ideas around that then allow us to say that in school we model what it looks like and sounds like and feels like to be caring citizens, and we work with our students to give them practice at that, and not contrived practice, but authentic and genuine practice as citizens, because that's what they are. Even when they're 5, walking into kindergarten, they're citizens of our school community and of the broader community. One of the things that we work towards and for is the notion and the thinking that learning, that asking questions, that figuring out answers continues way past the time you leave grade 12. And one of the things that we do is, how is it that you can engage in those conversations? How is it that you can ask those questions? And how is it that you can learn more? And so it's important for us as a system then to model that, so that our teachers and our principals and our vice principals and people who work further away from the school building and in other places are modeling that notion of lifelong learning, of asking questions and figuring out answers, and then trying something or thinking about something for a while and then coming back to that whole cycle again. We're preparing kids for that We're giving them some of the tools. We're helping them to extend some of those tools that they already have so that they can participate in thinking about that, so that they can participate in being innovators, so that they can participate in working outside of the school system, so that they can participate in going to formal education, so that they can participate in having families and raising families of their own that are formed on and value those notions of public education. Public education also needs to consider and be deliberate and conscious about how it can remove roadblocks for kids, how it can remove barriers for kids. And I think about that in connection to the notion of that there's equity of opportunity for students. That phrase might have been placed in other times as equity of access. But I'm talking about equity of opportunity. So that how is it that we can work with families and within our own systems to break down those barriers, to remove those roadblocks that would allow kids not to participate in something, that would have some students have the opportunity to do some things and some students have the opportunity not to do that and not to engage in that because of experience, because of demographics, because of location. So the notion then that we provide that equity, we work hard for that equity of opportunity for kids in our schools.
I have to say right at the outset that I don't think that we're there yet, nor are we going to be close to being a totally equitable society, but certainly public education is a great tool towards that objective. The other important thing about public education for me is that we found out just how public education contributes to the quality of life, not just for the people who are in the public schools, but to society as a whole. We were impressed by the fact that our children were able to go to local public schools which were representative of the society in which the children were growing up. It was very important to us that the school reflected the population of the communities in which we lived. They were able to learn how important it was to get along. They were able to learn, being newcomers to Canada, they were able to learn the values and responsibilities in Canadian society. They were also able to acquire the kinds of skills and values and knowledge that enabled them to become contributing citizens. We were struck by the fact that public education was indeed accessible, that you were not hindered by the ability to pay, that you could go to your local public school that was most accessible to you, and also that the public school system was working actively to try and make it open and accessible to all kinds of people, irrespective of race, religion, color, creed, ability, etc. That was a very important thing for us, and I think to this day it is still very important to me.
The public, in fact, includes all of us. The public schools are set up to make sure that there was room for everybody, that we missed people if they weren't there. We learned how to live with the people who lived around us, but also the people who we could imagine living with, even though they're not there. And the whole idea of preparing people in a public system is that the system itself, by recalling its roots and its beginnings, passes on the message that being a member of the public and a contributing member of the public are important. And they pass on the message, of course, that this is for everyone.
Our public education system has become an important social agency within society. It's a place where we know that our children can be safe, and where we know that as well that our children can be placed in an educational environment so that they can learn. These are responsibilities that we as parents would otherwise have to carry out ourselves in our homes and on a daily basis. And there's nothing wrong with homeschooling, but at the same time, it causes children to miss out on that social environment that's so very important as they're getting older. But I can tell you from experience that those children, those young people that I've met in my work as a judge, who have made a commitment to education, have very quickly used it and been able to use it to turn their lives around and to accomplish those things in life that they know are important to them, whether it is in the field of a career that they choose or whether it's simply as being a better parent and a better adult. If we took all of the money that we spent on educating adults while they're in the jail system and started spending it on the public education system, we'd probably not have to spend anywhere near what we're spending in the jails to educate people, just to get them the basic education that they need in order to get through the high schools and university years. It's a given that the citizens of tomorrow are in our education system. And that's why it's important that the education system devote the resources that need to be given to all of them equally, because those citizens who are there are people who are going to be running our banking systems and our school systems and our legal systems and all of our systems in society. Those are the future corporate presidents and directors. And so they're going to be making some fundamentally important decisions that are going to affect the lives of many other people other than them. And so when they're making those decisions, we need them to understand the importance of their responsibility to each other and as well the benefits that they're deriving from a public education system.
We help to build society. We engage kids in conversations. We engage them in dialogue about social justice. We engage them in dialogue about things like democracy. We engage them in discourse about issues like fairness and equity. And that's the kind of conversations that start when they're very, very young. And yes, they may look very different in kindergarten than they do in grade 12. But it's that continuity of the dialogue that we have with kids so that when they leave public education, they are confident that they can continue to participate in that conversation. I think about some folks who say our job is to prepare the future citizens of our world, of our city, of our province, of our country. But I would reframe that a little bit to say that when the students come to us, they're already citizens of the province, of the city, of the country, of our constituency. And our work then is to help them as they grow into that notion of citizenship, from the notion and the place that they are at right then and there. I think about what the Conference Board of Canada says, that we need our members of society to be good communicators, to be good team players, to be innovators, to be problem solvers. Those are those big ideas in education that we work through in public education. But even bigger than that, it's to be and to work through a civil society, to show kids that we care and in turn help them to care more, to show kids that it's good to be engaged in their community and to give back to their community, and then in turn have them do that kind of work through and with the school. But public education doesn't only work with students. Public education works with their families and works with communities. Lots of folks in our communities don't have kids in school. They don't have children in school. And so we have to think about public education also as this organization that is the community. Perhaps decades ago, churches were the cornerstones of communities. I would suggest that schools are the cornerstones of communities. They're places not just for students, but they're places for their families. They're places for people who don't have children to come to learn. We have senior citizens who walk in our buildings. We have senior citizens, for example, who come and volunteer in our buildings. And that all works together to form the basis of good public education. It's about the greater good. It's about the collective whole. Certainly, it is about developing each individual child, their potential and their capabilities. But how is it then that they can see themselves in what's more broad. Those are very big those are the very big goals of education. So not only what is it for each child and what is the pathway for each child, but how is it that they fit into the greater good? How is it that they fit into the broader sense of our community? How is it that they fit into civil society? So that's another thing that we think about in public education.
I came from a place where education was not available to those who were most in need of an education. What it did was it created a society for the privileged, and it created a huge number of people who did not fulfill their potential. Having come from that kind of a background, as I moved along from one country to another, I began to see even more clearly what the negative effects would be if you did not provide a public school education for everybody. In countries where you could only access education if you could pay for it, those who were in most need of that education didn't get it. Everybody lost out. The entire country lost out, the society lost out. The quality of life was good only for some and not for others.
Reason for education really hasn't changed for centuries now. We educate to help people become better people. And the overall feeling, of course, is that when you have better people and when they work together with each other, good people work together with each other, they in fact will form better societies, better communities, and be able to help each other, in fact, improve their lot in life. We need to remind ourselves over and over again that when new children come on the scene, when new young people come on the scene, it demands something new of us. It demands, an energy, and it demands a commitment to those new people, because those new people are going to form the adult world at some point in time. They're going to decide what the world will look like, either in our old age or even sooner. And that's why we have this kind of dual role in education, right? We want them to do really well at what they're doing and learn how to do the things they need to live really good lives. But we want to tell them what we think is really a good life and say, this is where we've fallen short. And in the end, we want them to be able to stand up and actually design their own worlds, right? Or make the changes that they think are necessary and have their chance at actually making the world a better place, just like we did, or just like I have in the various jobs that I've had, right? So the whole idea of public education is that you take an individual, regardless of color, creed, religion, any difference that they have, because they're all different, right? You take an individual and you, in fact, bring them up or help them to become part of the group. But not part of the group in terms of some mass movement or some, where we all believe the same thing, where in fact they become part of the group which is appreciative of the fact that we're all born different, that we all have different ways of living, that we all are raised different ways, right? And that we all can learn from each other. So that is the huge contribution, I think, that public education can make, and it's the perfect tool.
If we didn't have a public education system as we now have, we'd have to replace it with something. And what would we replace it with? We'd try to replace it with a system that went back to neighborhood, village schools, or smaller environments in which people cooperated with each other to educate their children. Back in the days before we had a public education system, I can imagine that the way that education worked was that the older people in the community would get together and spend time with the younger people to talk about the things that they needed to know, while the parents went out and took care of the basic needs of survival. And I imagine that that's the kind of thing that we do, is we'd have to look to members of our family and members of our neighborhoods and communities to spend time with our children, because as parents we wouldn't be able to. We'd have to go out and do what we could to ensure that they had food and shelter and clothing, and so somebody else would have to do that work for us if we as parents couldn't do it. That's where public education systems come from, is from that need that parents have to ensure that society helps them to take care of their children. Because everybody knows that it's not just the parents who are going to be responsible for their children. It's hard to quantify in terms of how much you need to spend and what you need to spend it on, but at the same time, our children are really missing out when they're placed in a school environment in which they're not able to have the resources available to them that they need. Some schools do not have the same resources as other schools, and so the inequities of society are sometimes left with the school systems, and that needs to be corrected. Because often it's the children who are in the inner cities who need the most assistance. School lunch programs are more needed in areas of low income than they are in areas of moderate to high income. Our children need to know that we want to invest in them and that they're important to us and that we're doing this for them. And they may not understand it directly because we may not be able to say it directly to them, but when they know that we're there, when they know that we show up at the parent-teacher interviews, when they know that we're concerned about how they're doing in schools, and that caring comes not only from the parents but also from the teachers and from other members of society that they're in contact with, then they know that they have to make an effort too, and that's what we want them to do. What the public education system does is it provides an opportunity for young people who are really interested in making the effort to succeed, and they will succeed. And if you succeed well at school, you're going to succeed well at everything else.
But I certainly think we need to be aware of the challenges that public education faces. We don't want to end up in a situation of crisis. I think what we need to do is to make it clear that our society, that our public understands that we should not take public education for granted. That's a danger. The fact that public education has existed for so long in this country, and the fact that the majority of people make such good use of public education causes us to take it for granted. And I think one of our responsibilities is to make absolutely certain the goals of public education are clear, but more importantly, that we have the public participating in public education. Once upon a time, there was a very narrow definition of what the responsibilities of public schools were. Today, it would depend on who you spoke to. Different people have different opinions of what it is public education and public schools should be doing. At the same time, I don't think it has become clearly understood that as society becomes more complex and as things change and as we're faced with new challenges, the burden that's placed on public schools increases. In other words, there's nothing that's removed from the responsibilities of public education as we continue to add new responsibilities to the schools. It's very important for us to know that despite the efforts being made by people in the public education system and by supporters of the public education system, we still have huge gaps in our society. We still have huge inequities in our society. You can look around you and find out that while on the one hand we encourage immigration and we invite people to come to our country, many of the new immigrants, especially those coming from war-torn countries, people coming from very difficult circumstances, are finding it difficult to survive. They're finding it difficult to take advantage of what's offered in this country. And at the part of it all is the fact that additional efforts have to be made in the education system to allow them to take part in these things, to allow them to be successful. We have some fairly uninformed criticisms of public schools. I think that people's intentions are good. They want better quality public education. But at the same time, I don't think people are making informed judgments about what's taking place in schools. And I think we're only going to change that if we involve people in the dialogue on what's going on in schools, what should be happening in schools, and how together we can make that possible. What we need to do is to educate ourselves and educate the general public on the challenges faced by public schools and why we should all be supporting those schools in order to do their jobs better. There are simple things that we see in our society. If you look in the media, you'll find continual tasks being placed at the doorstep of the schools. And simply because the majority of our children gather at the doors of the public schools, it seems to be the place that has to deal with the challenges. But it would be totally unfair to expect schools to continue to pick up more and more responsibilities alone.
I would say in the late 70s and early 80s, we began to look at the public differently, and we actually probably emphasized the private more than the public. And the discussion actually was driven by non-educators or educators who didn't think about education as carefully as they might have, and didn't realize kind of the legacy that they might be losing. But at that time, in the late 70s and early 80s, we started this anxiety, which we still have to this day, right? That our children are not going to be as well off as we are, right? And when we talked about well off, we were concerned mainly about money. It wasn't questioned very much. You know, all kinds of panels were set up to take a look at schooling particularly, and they came up with the conclusion that economics were really what should drive schools. We shifted from something that was primarily public, where we said the main reason we need schools and the main purpose for public schools is in fact to create a public, or to prepare democratic citizens for participation in the democratic life of their country. Well, that shifted to contributing to the economy. The shift has continued, so that we've put a high emphasis on freedom of choice, a high emphasis of making sure that there are a whole number of choices out there. Those freedoms of choice allow people to withdraw even more from public life, so that they could in fact homeschool, which is kind of the extreme, private school, charter schools, you know, use their money, their tax money as voucher systems and whatever else. They could choose what kind of schooling their child received. It's really become much more privatized, much more a question of private good, of private interest, of private benefit, of private advantage, and the language is that kind of language, as opposed to public good, the benefit of the public, improvement of the public, you know, making our communities better, that kind of thing. We haven't lost it completely, see. So it's kind of important that we now, and this is the crisis, that we now actually renew that conversation that was begun years ago now, but we've actually neglected for the last 2 or 3 decades. We need to have global responsibility, there's no question about that, but where we live our lives is local. And it's at that level we can actually directly intervene and directly insert ourselves into people's lives and help them out. And we have not lost that in Manitoba. We're at risk of losing it because there's huge pressure, and it's all based on economics, right? There's huge pressure to do away with taxes and have that all done provincially, right? But I'll tell you what, where they've done it provincially, there's always a bunch of people fall off the table. They don't get looked after. I'm encouraged when I actually get people involved in this, and when they can talk about it, they're willing to talk about it, right? But I'm discouraged about what I hear in the public through the media and so on.
Our children need to know that we want to invest in them, and that they're important to us, and that we're doing this for them. And they may not understand it directly, because we may not be able to say it directly to them, but when they know that we're there, when they know that we show up at the parent-teacher interviews, when they know that we're concerned about how they're doing in schools, and that caring comes not only from the parents but also from the teachers and from other members of society that they're in contact with, then they know that they have to make an effort too, and that's what we want them to do. What the public education system does is it provides an opportunity for young people who are really interested in making the effort to succeed, and they will succeed. And if you succeed well at school, you're going to succeed well at everything else.
The first teachers of our kids are their parents. And so in public education, we embrace that partnership. We want to work together so that we can learn from each other and help each other as we both walk alongside that child. And sometimes that pathway is easier than it is for some students. Sometimes that pathway has fewer speed bumps than it does for other kids. But it's the notion that if we work together, that's how we're going to be working with that child in order for them to move through, and I don't mean just move through kindergarten to grade 12, but to move through discovering themselves, to move through understanding their greater potential, to move through and build hope and optimism for them. Because public education is about a hopeful future. It's saying that we can all learn. And that's certainly that notion of, and that phrase that we often hear, success for all, sounds very simplistic, and some might say highly overused. But it is a very simple and powerful phrase that is very truthful in terms of public education and when situated in public education, that we believe in success for all children. We also know that for students, one person's success might look different than another's, and that's why we allow for those multiple pathways in public education. So how can we do that? We can do that by working together. We can do that by learning from parents. We can do that in classrooms with teachers. We can do that as we bring other supports into the classroom. But we also do it by listening carefully to students. We also do it by asking them questions. We also do it by engaging them in their own education. And I don't just mean by them doing the work that needs to be done, but by asking them about what matters in school, and by asking them, if you could do things differently in school, what might that look like? By asking them, what did you do at school today? What went well for you? What might have been better for you today? And listening carefully and genuinely to those answers. Because public education needs to be responsive to the answers that we hear from kids and their families. And we need to work, and we do work, at building in that authenticity of voice of kids. Because what they have to teach us is so very, very important. And what they teach us as teachers is they teach us about hopefulness. They teach us about perseverance. They teach us about passion. And those are the things that we take from our conversations and our interactions every day at school to work and continue to work with kids and their families.
I think we may not be doing a good enough job of inviting people to participate in the dialogue. We may not be doing a good enough job to, not write off people, but rather invite them to be supporters and helpers. And I've seen people, a friend here, a business person here in Winnipeg, who also was critical of the public school system, but once he started working with an organization that was involved with public schools, became actively involved and willing to learn about what was taking place in public schools. I remember a very famous line that he once said in a public forum. He said, "I've giving up on public education." And he had changed his attitude totally, being an open-minded person, being a very well-educated person, and one who is concerned about the well-being of our society and about the well-being of our city and our province. Both the schools should be reaching out to the community should be reaching into the schools to make sure that we are able to provide the kind of service and do the kinds of things that public schools should be doing. I think what we need to do is to mobilize and work with the people who are seeing the public school system as not serving their needs. We need to work with those people to make them understand what the challenges are. We need to work with them to make them understand and invite them to be partners in this venture of public education. And even if they choose to send their children elsewhere, I think they need to see that we are all jointly responsible for making a quality education available to every segment of our society. In our province here in Manitoba, we have enough people of goodwill We have enough people who understand that education for all is important. We have enough people who are arguing for a more equitable society. We have many people in the communities which are the most deprived who are making it very clear to us that more needs to be done to help them make these things work. It's not that people are asking others to do it for them. One of the most promising things for me is that people within the communities in greatest need are saying that they are willing to do their part, but the rest of society needs to support them in doing their part. And I think that if we rally around our public schools and we strengthen the communities surrounding those schools rather than weakening them, then there's some hope. Public school education is one of the greatest hopes we have of equalizing things in our society, but I still think that we have a long way to go in order to make that a reality.
We have a treasure. You know, public education is a fairly new thing. It's a treasure. It's like a pearl in an oyster, right? It's available to all of us, right? We're going to have to dive a little deeper than we had to in the past to find that pearl there. We're going to have to just dig a little deeper and say, you know, what is this treasure that John Weens and other people are talking about, right? This treasure called public education, which is less than 2 centuries old, which has improved the lot of virtually everybody that it's touched. We need to maintain these small communities where it makes a difference who you are. And it makes a difference what kind of contribution that you bring to the table. And it makes a difference that you bring the contribution to the table, right? So if you get too large, the consequence is that you lose touch with people, you go down. And that's true for governments. It's been true for governments for centuries, you know, millennia. In fact, when you lose touch with what's happening on the ground, you lose all the things that you value and stand for. But on a daily level, it means that people kind of disappear. They drop off the table. We need to talk to people, real people, face to face, about what education is about, right? Get their views on what they think education is about. Get their views on what the public school meant to them, right? And tell people, like, give that as much airtime, right? Because quite frankly, it's the most important thing we do, is educate our children. It's the most important thing we do in the world, is educate our children. So, and people love to talk about how they grew up, how they had to learn things, what they learned on the way to becoming an adult, and how now as an adult they use those things to get along with their neighbors, help themselves, and so on. So we just need to invite people into that conversation. The people who have the power need to open the spaces, open the doors, invite people into the room to talk about those things.